Nutcracker and the Mouse King. By ETA Hoffman. Chapter 3. The Favorite. Mary, in fact, could not tear herself away from the table of presents, since she had just discovered on it something, till now unseen. The marching off of Fred's hussars, previously paraded close in front of the Christmas tree, left exposed to view a very remarkable little man, who stood still in the background, as if quietly awaiting his turn for notice. His figure, indeed, was not much to be proud of, for, besides that his rather long thick body by no means fitted his small thin legs, his head also seemed far too big. His nice clothes, however, which bespoke a person of taste and cultivation, went far to make up for this deformity. He wore a very fine, shiny, violet hussar jacket, with many white buttons and braidings, pantaloons of the same stuff, and the most elegant boots that ever adorned the feet of a dandy undergraduate, or of an officer. They fitted his neat little legs as closely as if painted on them. Ridiculous it was indeed, that, with this costume, he had hanging behind him a short clumsy cloak or hood, which looked exactly like wood, and a queer woodsman's cap on his head. But Mary bethought herself that Godfather Drosselmeier also sometimes wore a very ugly lounging jacket and a dreadful cap, yet was a dear, good godfather for all that. Also, she considered that their godfather would not be nearly so good-looking as the small figure, even if, in other respects, he were dressed out as smartly. As Mary kept looking harder and harder at this mannequin, who had quite taken her heart, at first sight, she came to perceive what a kindly nature was expressed on his countenance. His clear, green, and certainly too prominent eyes bespoke nothing but friendliness and benevolence. It suited his looks well that his chin bore a well-trimmed beard of white cotton, which set off the pleasant smile on his bright red mouth. "Ah, Papa!" cried Mary at length, "who is to have this dearest little man on the Christmas tree?" "That," said her father, "that fellow, my dear child, is to make himself useful to you all. His work is to crack hard nuts for you, and he belongs to Louisa as much as to Fred and to you." With this her father carefully took the figure off the table, and, lifting up its wooden cloak, made the mannequin's mouth gape open to show 2 rows of very sharp white teeth. Then he told Mary to put in a nut, and, crack! Dash, the man had crushed it, so that the shell fell in pieces, and Mary got the small kernel in her hand. Now Mary and all might know that the elegant little man belonged to the race of nutcrackers, and practiced the profession of his ancestors. The little girl cried out for joy, when her father said, "Since friend Nutcracker pleases you so much, dear Mary, he shall be your special charge and pet, though, as I said, Louisa and her Fred have as much right to use him as you." Mary at once took him into her arms, and made him crack nuts, yet picking out the smallest ones, in order that the mannequin might not have to stretch his mouth so wide open, which was not good for him. Louisa came to look, and for her also friend Nutcracker had to perform his service, which he seemed to do with good will, for he kept on smiling in the most amiable way. Meanwhile, Fred had grown tired of all his riding and drilling, so, when he heard such a pleasant cracking of nuts, he ran to his sisters and laughed heartily at the funny little man, who, as Fred also liked to eat nuts, passed from hand to hand, and was never allowed to stop opening and shutting his mouth. Fred always kept shoving in the biggest and hardest nuts, but all of a sudden there was a crack, crick, then 3 teeth fell out of Nutcracker's mouth, and his under jaw went loose and wobbly. "Oh, my poor dear Nutcracker!" cried Mary, snatching him out of Fred's hands. "What a silly, stupid fellow!" exclaimed Fred. "Sets up for being a Nutcracker, and hasn't a good set of grinders. He doesn't seem to be very first-rate at his business. Hand him over, Mary. He shall go on cracking nuts for me, even though he loses all his teeth and his whole chin into the bargain, which is what such a good-for-nothing deserves." "No, no!" cried Mary in tears. "You are not to have him, my dear. Nutcracker. Just see how sadly he looks at me and shows his sore little mouth. But you are a cruel boy, you beat your horse and have your soldiers shot. That's what should be, you don't understand these things, answered Fred. But the Nutcracker belongs to me as much as to you, hand him over here. Mary began to cry bitterly, and made haste to wrap up the wounded Nutcracker in her small pocket handkerchief. Her parents and godfather Drosselmeyer interfered. The latter, to Mary's grief, took Fred's part, but her father said, "I have put Nutcracker under Mary's protection, and since, as I see, he now needs it, she has full power over him, and nobody is to say a word against her. Besides, I am very much surprised at Fred that he should require fresh duty of a man injured on service. As a good soldier, he ought to know that wounded men are never put back in the ranks." Fred was much ashamed of himself, and, without troubling further about Nuts or Nutcracker, slipped off to the other side of the table, where his hussars had been posted for the night, after putting out the proper pickets. Mary picked up Nutcracker's lost teeth. Around his hurt chin she bound a nice white ribbon, taken off her dress, and then wrapped the poor little fellow, who looked very wan and dejected, more carefully than ever in her pocket handkerchief. Thus she held him, rocking him like a baby in her arms, while she turned over the pretty picture books which lay among the rest of the presents. She became quite cross, as was not at all usual with her, when Godfather Drosselmeyer laughed a great deal, and kept asking how she could go on so with that hideous little creature. The strange resemblance to Drosselmeyer which had struck her at first setting eyes on the mannequin, came again into her mind, and she spoke quite seriously. "Who knows, Godfather, whether you, if you were to make yourself as fine as my dear Nutcracker, and had as nice shiny boots on, who knows whether you would look as pretty as he does?" Mary did not understand why her parents laughed so loud, or why the councillor got so red in the face and did not join in the laugh as heartily as before. There may have been some particular reason for this. Thank you for watching. If you would like to support the channel, please like and subscribe.